Valve makes games. Or rather, they used to. The last game they've made, the last game they've even talked about making was Half-Life Alyx. Well, technically it was Counter-Strike 2, and then there was Aperture Desk Job, which does have some story to it, but you get what I'm saying. The last game that Valve has made, the last mainline entry for a Valve IP, was Half-Life Alyx, all the way back in 2020, almost 4 years ago. But that's not how it used to be. Valve used to be cranking out games what felt like every day. You'd wake up and get on Google to check what new game Valve was working on, and after a certain point, you'd see this. Because after Dota 2, Valve seemingly moved away from coming up with a new game every single year. And since it's pretty relevant, Portal 2 would end up being their last story-driven game for quite a while. A nearly 9-year-long while. Like many other game companies, Valve probably came to the conclusion that yearly releases were no longer viable, and left that to the phone industry, which to this day proves that you don't need to reinvent the wheel, you just need to add another camera to it. But I'm sure you've heard this story a billion half-lives before. Games got more complex, production got more expensive, and marketing campaigns became just as important as the final product itself. You don't need me to tell you all that again. And that's not what this video is about, anyway. It's more so about the community, and how they never gave up on Valve stories. We never got a Half-Life 3 or Episode 3, but we did get Entropy Zero and Entropy Zero 2, and also Entropy Zero Uprising. Also, Episode 3, whatever that is. What I mean is that the Half-Life community started making their own narrative, their own spin-off mainline entries, quenching the thirst for whatever Gabe Newell was cooking. Because much like the Promised Land, they knew they were never going to get to it, so they made their own. But Half-Life wasn't the only franchise Valve was known for, and naturally it wouldn't take long before its not-so-distant cousin would get the same entropic treatment. And with that, after probably dropping viewer retention by 90%, we finally get to Portal Revolution. However, before I actually start talking about it, I do want to give you some background on how this video came to be, because I did go through a few stages coming up with it. When I first started working on this video, I was actually playing with the idea of talking about each Portal game individually, turning it into a 3-part series leading up to Portal Revolution. However, when I started writing the script, I realized that that wouldn't really work. For one, Portal, or Portal 1 as I'm going to refer to it to avoid any confusion, isn't a very story-heavy game. There is a plot, of course, and I am going to touch on it. There's not a whole lot to it. Not enough for its own video anyway. Portal 2, on the other hand, well, that's where we learn most of what we know about Aperture. And inherently, it's a much longer game, so you could probably tell how separating the two would have made the series pretty top-heavy. I guess chronologically it also wouldn't make sense, since Portal Revolution does take place between Portal 1 and 2. And then there's also supplemental lore bits like Aperture Desk Job and Portal 2 Ratman. There's actually quite a lot more to the universe than I initially thought, more than just placing portals. It actually has a whole lot more to do with shower curtains. At this point, I should probably say I'm by no means an expert in Portal lore, or the greater Valve universe as a whole. I did do 5 minutes of research before writing the script, but if you do spot any inaccuracies, feel free to put them in an Excel sheet where I won't ever see them. Or just leave a comment, that works too. Anyway, Portal Revolution. Let's talk about it. Like pretty much every other Valve game, Portal Revolution is broken up into separate chapters, in this case 8, with the first one being the human resource. It starts off in what looks like a hotel room but is actually a stasis chamber, and it's almost identical to the one at the start of Portal 2. While you're told you've been in stasis for 72 days, this doesn't mean you've been at Aperture for only that long. In fact, the announcer says this is your 36th year with them. But, much like at the beginning of Portal 2, subjects were woken up regularly for some mental wellness checks. Now, I should get one big question out of the way right here at the very beginning of the video, and that is, are you playing as Chell? Well, starting with the game's description, Portal Revolution tells a brand new story using new characters. You play as a test subject who is awoken by a personality sphere called Sterling, who, by the way, is the announcer, playing very much as a sort of Whitley from Portal 2, and he's one of the two characters you'll interact with throughout the game. The description doesn't expressly say we're not playing as Chell, but the terms new character and a test subject strongly suggest that. Also, we know from the comic Portal 2 Ratman that Chell was put in stasis for an indefinite amount of time after Portal 1. Through various means, the community has actually estimated this time period to be around 20 years, therefore making it unlikely that Chell could have been in stasis for 36. Anyway, this is all unnecessary, because we don't even need to speculate on this. The developers themselves have said that we're not playing as Chell. Getting back to the actual game, the reason Sterling woke you up is to join the Human Emergency Response team. And to continue, we have to agree to Aperture's terms of service. In reality, I have no idea what this contract is, but if you want to try to read through it, be my guest. I'll even slow it down for you. Signing it allows you to leave the chamber and get a view of the bounds of Aperture Science, where in actuality most of the game takes place, jumping back and forth between various test tracks. For now, however, the first few test chambers are very reminiscent of the beginning of Portal 1, when Chell didn't have the dual portal gun and was instead limited to the pre-programmed portals. Try saying that 3 times fast. As for the actual levels, Revolution does make use of all technologies in Portal 2, as well as some additional original mechanics which we'll discuss later on. One of the ones you'll encounter at this point, apart from the cubes and buttons, which I'm sure I don't need to talk about, is the laser, or thermal discouragement beam, as it's referred to in Portal 2. The reason it's called that is because, despite its main purpose being to activate different elements of puzzles, it can also be used to destroy turrets, hence discouragement. The laser was actually a replacement to the high-energy pellets used in Portal 1, which also appear in Half-Life 2, and they were probably taken out of Portal 2 because they were really annoying to play with. Aside from that, the laser also introduces the weighted pivot cube, which lets you direct the path of the beam in any direction, apart from up or downwards. Other mechanics you'll encounter are the hard light bridge, the blue path you can walk on, the aerial faith plates, which are catapults launching you in different directions, and excursion funnels, the blue and orange beams which once again allow you to float in a specific direction. These are introduced gradually throughout the first few puzzles, but the game does kind of assume you'll at least have some experience with them, otherwise the levels might take a bit to solve. I do have to add that the puzzles throughout the game are very creative, and most of them aren't similar at all to the ones in Portal 1 or 2, apart from the original mechanics. The devs have also balanced the difficulty pretty well, in my opinion. You're not just gonna breeze through the whole game because you played through Portal 1 or 2. And no, I won't discuss each puzzle in particular, mostly because, well, that would take forever, there's 40 of them. But also because I highly encourage you to play through the game, preferably before watching the rest of this video, because there will be spoilers. But even if you decide to keep watching, which, by the way, thanks for that, the game itself is still a lot of fun, so it probably won't matter as much. After solving the first 9 test chambers, Sterling pulls you out of the track to explain what the actual situation is, but not before hiring you as Aperture staff. This will allow you to travel relatively freely throughout the facility, opening security doors, but also launching you into the second chapter of the game. The default route takes place in the maintenance sections of Aperture Science, solving puzzles with the objective of making it up to the surface, something which, as far as I'm aware, was never really explorable in the original Portal games. At the start, Sterling explains how the Human Emergency Response Team was just a ruse to take you out of stasis, the actual reason being the imminent collapse of the reactor core. He tells us that the central core is no longer operational and how that has caused the facility to fall into disrepair. He says he did try to maintain the facility himself, but he did find a way to restore the original core and needs a human, you, to do it. Following him takes you through the turret disposal facility, basically a pit where Aperture shreds broken turrets. There's also a moment here when Sterling briefly brings up the protagonist's family and implies that something bad happened to them, which again might make you believe we're playing as Chell, but the devs did say we weren't, so we're not. You also go through a puzzle where you have to turn off a set of turbines which Sterling says could go supersonic, but well, I'll flex my degree a bit here. Those fan blades could not go supersonic. Physically. They shattered way before that due to a phenomenon called tip speed. Basically, the tip of the blades would go supersonic before the rotor actually did, literally tearing the turbine apart. So, no, they couldn't. Anyway, this has no story implications at all. I just thought I'd let you know. A bit further ahead, you also come across a lone turret, which essentially acts as a morality test. You could, in theory, just throw it into the shredder for no apparent reason, or you could leave it alone. Either way, nothing changes. Or at least, I don't think it does. I haven't tried because I'm not a monster. However, this all comes after Sterling gave you a lecture on how turrets do theoretically feel pain, so deciding to shred it is pretty much a confirmed sign of psychosis. You can also try to take it with you. The puzzle does let you do that, but unfortunately there's a loading screen at the end, and the turret doesn't make it through. After another short puzzle, you enter an office where Sterling says Aperture employees used to monitor test subjects. Here you can actually find a computer telling you to insert a disc into its DVD drive. At this point I realize I could make this video as needlessly intricate as I want. I could tell you about how on the screen, disc is spelled with a C, which is the British spelling of disc, but also the preferred spelling of disc storing audio, according to Merriam-Webster. In the game, inserting the disc will open an observation room overlooking one of the test chambers, which obviously isn't really related to audio. The only other explanation would therefore be that the devs are using the British spelling. Sadly, I couldn't find any information online about where the studio is based, so the only thing I can go off of is the voice actors, who do have a slight Australian accent. If that is the case, then that would explain the spelling of the disc on the computer, and I wouldn't have to go into the lore implications it would otherwise have, since Aperture is located in the United States, so their operating system would probably use American spelling. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is I could, theoretically, waste your time telling you about the spelling of disc on the screen, but that probably won't be relevant to the video, so I won't. What I will say is that in the same office, you can also find a presentation on some sort of Aperture device, but sadly it's impossible to take anything from it because most of the text and diagrams are redacted. However, fortunately, there is actually an exact replica of this presentation further on, which provides some nice explanation for something that will be relevant later. In the meantime, the next puzzle is probably one of the most unique in the whole game. Not because of the mechanics, in fact, they're the same as those used to take down both GLaDOS and Wheatley in Portal 1 and 2, but because of its execution and great level design. Essentially, to solve this puzzle, you have to make use of timed bombs, placing your portal to face these cracked panes of glass. As I said, the concept is simple, but the traversal is actually pretty complex. The level design is made in such way that you can only place certain portals from specific angles, with progress being non-linear, having you move back and forwards through the level with only one portal at your disposal. It is possible that I'm looking too far into it, but to me this is an example of how creative the dev team was when making Revolution, and it's not even the most outlandish. Meanwhile, after another pretty complex puzzle making use of a variety of tech, you finally make it to, surprisingly, given the series record with dark twists, the surface. Well, more specifically, you make it to an elevator Sterling found which leads up to the surface, but not out of the enrichment center as a whole. Anyway, taking it will put you into the game's next chapter. The third chapter, appropriately named The Surface, takes place on, well, you guessed it, the surface. The puzzles are now carried out in an incredibly dilapidated section of Aperture, arguably even more so than those in Portal 2. While in that game you could see plants colonizing the environment and some sunlight peeking through the ceiling, Revolution takes it to a whole other level from the very start, with ceilings having completely caved in and a window giving you a clear view of the outside world as well as your main objective. The spire plays a very important role in this game, not just as a conclusion, although it is a strong one, but also as a means of introducing some interesting twists throughout the narrative. It is very much Second Phase's approach to taking the Half-Life universe out of the orange box, but we'll get to that later. Cerning once again tells you that the only way to progress is through test tracks. It is a Portal game after all. This is because, as he puts it, the test tracks were built to be more durable than the maintenance hallways. Therefore, they're the only ones still standing. Mostly. Now, it may be difficult to tell from the video, but you may be able to recognize this first room from somewhere. That's because it is, in fact, one of the chambers in Portal 1. More specifically, 12 out of 19. Judging by the state of the chamber, we can tell it's been a pretty long time since Chell first went through it, since pretty much every surface, other than the portal surfaces, is covered in plants and debris. To me, level design is one of the most important aspects of a video game, and it's one of the reasons I've come to love the Souls series so much. So, in my opinion, this seamless inclusion of a level from the original into this brand new environment just puts this game onto a whole other level. But even apart from that, it's a pretty genius way of grounding Revolution into the universe even more. As far as I could tell, it's the only crossover level in the whole game, and it's so subtly done that I think a decent number of players didn't even realize going through it, especially since the ones from here on are, once again, original designs. The following levels see the introduction of both the repulsion and propulsion gels, which are among the earliest Aperture inventions, dating all the way back to the 1950s. As a reference point, the company Aperture Science Innovators was only incorporated by Cave Johnson in 1947, and the blue repulsion gel would already be used in test chambers by 1953. Interestingly enough, you don't actually see any use or even reference to the gels in Portal 1, but then again, I don't think at that time Valve had yet come up with a comprehensive Aperture timeline. Most of the information we know about the game universe actually comes from Portal 2, especially anything related to the history of Aperture. Throughout these levels, Cerning will drop some information here and there, such as the fact that your portal gun is limited in how far away it can place portals, something which obviously isn't the case for every portal gun. Refer to the Portal 2 ending for context. He'll also give you a summary of what happened in Portal 1, in case you didn't already know, which potentially could be a good chunk of people, since the Portal games are technically locked behind a paywall, while this game isn't. It's completely free, as long as you own Portal 2. Judging by the way he refers to GLaDOS, though, as well as calling Chell a monster for destroying her, you can kinda tell he is still very much loyal to Aperture, and would gladly bring her back, if he could. Turrets are also introduced in these levels, and there are some achievements tied to them, requiring you to solve puzzles without deactivating any. However, getting rid of them is also fairly entertaining, especially since now they do fight back. There is another mechanic tied to the gels which comes into play at this point, the cleansing fields. They're essentially a water curtain preventing any gel passing through as well as washing it off any objects it may have stuck to. In classic Aperture fashion, Cerning lets you know that the cleansing fields are hazardous to humans, and if you're exposed to them for long enough, they'll wash all your skin off. League players probably already knew that though. Another thing Cerning says is that while he wishes he could help you, even after watching hundreds of test subjects, he still doesn't know how to solve these puzzles. This is one thing I don't understand why the developers wrote this way, because in Portal 2, Whitley does try to tell you how to solve a puzzle, but Aperture hard-coded the cores to not be able to. Presumably, that would tamper with their test results. In my opinion, this could have been a much more plausible reasoning, especially considering how so far Cerning has come across as very knowledgeable of the ins and outs of the Enrichment Center. I personally would find it hard to believe that he wouldn't know how to solve the puzzles. Anyway, in Chamber 8 of this test track, you finally obtain the dual portal gun, the one that can place both portals individually. In a very stark contrast to the one you have now, this one is really beat up, showing that it's probably been there ever since the Enrichment Center blew up, if not even longer. It's not definitive whether these chambers are like this as direct consequence of the explosion in Portal 1, or they've just fallen to the test of time, but either way it provides some very good context for a great design of the portal gun. Not long after, you once again leave the test track and have to traverse the maintenance scaffoldings to progress. At some point, you come across a vent which leads to a slightly hidden room with a sign reading White Box Master Control Program, Studio Box 2. After a few minutes looking around, I couldn't find anything interesting in there. I even tried bringing over all the boxes from the puzzle nearby, thinking it might trigger some sort of Slenderina Easter egg, but it didn't do anything. It's also not the only room of this sort. There was another one earlier in the chapter which was once again hidden behind a small vent, except that one had a strangely clean chair in the middle of a room with mushrooms and moss growing all over the walls and ceiling. There was also a locked door on one of the walls, but other than that, nothing, just a spooky room. After this last puzzle, you're placed into the 4th chapter of the game, but not before Sterling tells you that, because you were forced to leave the initial test track, you're now completely off course, and will have to find another way to the spire. The 4th chapter is called The Diversion, probably referring to the fact you're now off course entirely and have to find another way to your objective. After a few puzzles, one of which made use of a ball instead of a cube for once, which is really imaginative, you get another good view of the spire. A considerable amount of time must have passed since you first made it to the surface, since the sun is now setting, which is another thing I love to see in linear games like this. Not only does it make the game world more dynamic, presenting it in a different light as time goes on, but it also makes it more immersive and convincing. No matter what, in the world we know, time will always be passing. The sun eventually sets and the day comes to an end. And despite how existential that may sound, to me it's great when games can reflect this passage of time as you're playing the game, through the game itself. It's a very simple thing to implement, but in my opinion it's one of the most important aspects of a good narrative, and could easily go unnoticed. And yes, you did just listen to me talk about how virtual light changing in the Portal game is tied to existentialism. We're doing God's work here. The levels coming up introduce yet another unique mechanic, a power breaker which can turn on and off various devices in the test chamber, such as the emancipation grills and the exit doors. You'll find you'll have to coordinate turning the power on and off throughout the puzzle, since you won't want certain devices working at one point, but eventually you will need it on to exit the test chamber. After completing these levels, you're once again brought to the surface, but this time also your ultimate objective, the spire. Described by Cerning as a tunnel reaching from the lowest point of apertures to the highest, the spire holds the means to restoring the reactor core, and it won't be long until you can figure out what that entails. For now though, you do come across something I promised I'd touch on earlier, that being a non-redacted version of the presentation in the observation offices. It seems to be a pitch for some new aperture teleportation technology, appropriately named the non-local matter displacement device. A label diagram on one of the slides offers a visual representation of the device, but other than that, the presentation doesn't offer any technical information on how the device works or how it was built. The slides focus more on the business side of things, mentioning potential breakthroughs like needleless blood donations and reducing moon rock transportation costs, which, by the way, is pretty relevant to the Portal universe. You see, in Portal 2 you're given some context as to specifically why the portal gun seems to only be able to place portals on white walls. In short, this initially unassuming white paint is actually moon rock, and in 1982, despite facing bankruptcy, as well as ruined by an investigation into astronauts testing for them, Aperture would buy $70 million worth of them, allowing them to develop the iconic white substance which would come to be known as conversion gel, the third and final type of gel they'd ever make. However, moon rocks would impact Aperture a lot more than just by making portal technology more viable. They would actually indirectly lead to the end of Aperture as it had been known for all those decades, because as its founder Cave Johnson would come to find out, the lunar rocks he'd been playing with were actually incredibly poisonous. The exposure would impact his health severely and ultimately lead to his death, but more importantly, it would bring about the rise of GLaDOS. Knowing he was probably living his last moments, Cave Johnson commissioned the development of a process through which his mind could be transferred into a computer, so that, theoretically, he could live on forever. This process would come to be known as brain mapping, and it does play another important role in Portal Revolution. Because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, however, Johnson also ordered the scientists that, should they not be able to put him into this computer in time, they should have Carolyn, his long-running secretary, run Aperture instead. You probably don't need me to tell you that GLaDOS is not Cave Johnson. Her voice is not similar to his at all, and also it was confirmed in Portal 2 that she is in fact Carolyn. This might rightfully lead you to believe that brain mapping was not finished in time for Cave Johnson. And indeed, that's what everyone thought for over a decade. But that was before we got Aperture Desk Job. An otherwise insignificant tech demo for the new Steam Deck, Desk Job has a fairly short runtime of around 30 minutes, and for the most part doesn't provide anything new to the Aperture story. That is, until the very end. After inventing a toilet which can shoot missiles, you decide to pitch it to Cave Johnson himself, despite the fact that, according to your partner Grady, no one had seen him for years. And sure enough, he's not in his office. But what is in his office is a gigantic stone statue of Cave Johnson's head. And in fact, that is Cave Johnson. As it turns out, the scientists were able to transfer his mind into a computer. However, it had to be so large it rendered Cave Johnson's new android body completely useless. Now you may be wondering why they didn't still put him in charge, but that's because Cave Johnson was so upset with his physical appearance that he killed the scientists and prohibited anyone from entering his office indefinitely. Of course, I can't really speak to the validity of Aperture Desk Job as a canon entry into the Portal series. It introduces quite a few discrepancies. For one, it appears to take place between the 1960s and 70s, setting its events before Aperture had even purchased the moon rocks, let alone started looking into brain mapping technology to save Cave Johnson. Not only that, but Grady also implies that Johnson must have already been scanned into this computer for years, making the time differential way too significant to realistically fit with the original Portal timeline, at least from my perspective. So if that's the case, I've now successfully gone on the longest possible tangent for absolutely no reason, just because I read the words moon rocks. Genius. Moving on, not much further into the spire, you eventually come up to its control room, and from here you can get a clear view of the displacement device. To progress, you have to activate the machine, which will bring up two small chambers from the room floor. These chambers are part of the teleportation device, and some of you might have recognized that they're actually very similar to the teleporters used by the Resistance in Half-Life 2. Without wanting to get too much into Half-Life lore, this is a Portal-oriented video after all, I do want to add that the teleporters used by Eli and his crew work through the concept of the theoretical Calabi-Yau manifold. Basically a 6-dimensional prism that, in the Half-Life universe, can be used to achieve instantaneous teleportation through space by transcending the 3 dimensions we usually live in. The teleporter in Revolution seems to work in the same general sense, and Sterling does briefly note how the device works by bypassing our 3-dimensional plane, essentially the same theory as the Calabi-Yau teleporters. Before Sterling can use the device to fix the facility, you first need to calibrate it, initially by teleporting a companion cube, which, of course, you'll then need to destroy, and then by teleporting yourself. After stepping into the chamber, Sterling will provide some more context as to what his plan is, and that is to reassemble the central core, which, if you haven't figured out by now, is indeed GLaDOS. He says that after the Portal 1 explosion, GLaDOS wasn't completely destroyed but rather broken apart and scattered all over the enrichment center, meaning that with the use of the displacement device, he could, in theory, bring her back together. Of course, if you know anything about Portal, you'll probably not want to bring back GLaDOS. But at this point, you can't stop the process anymore. You're already in the chamber, and Sterling starts the test. Only, it doesn't really go according to plan. You start Chapter 5, the cutting room floor, at the bottom of Aperture, with the portal gun on the ground in front of you, broken. The displacement device failed, and after a sequence pretty much identical to that in Half-Life 2, you end up here. The cause of the malfunction is actually the thing you're looking at, the portal gun. We know this because on one of the walls in the spire there was a poster notifying staff that teleportation devices should not be brought inside the teleporter. It is strange how Sterling didn't pick up on this either, since he did seem to know a lot about the spire. The only explanation I could come up with is that in his excitement to bring back GLaDOS, he didn't realize. It's not the most satisfying conclusion, but at least it's plausible. In the meantime, the traversal at the start of this chapter is really well done. You no longer have the portal gun, so the only thing you can do is walk. And you'd probably think a walking sequence would be pretty boring, and yeah, in most games it is, but the level design here is made more to resemble some sort of parkour section from an Uncharted game than just a series of hallways like in Half-Life. The path you take leads to a security checkpoint where test subjects are processed by Aperture for testing. There are actually two separate seating areas, one for test subjects and the other for employees, the latter having comfier seats and also propaganda. But more importantly, it indicates that this part of the facility was used during the time and Aperture started encouraging employees to volunteer for the tests themselves. As a company, Aperture started out testing on the very elite of society, that being people like athletes or astronauts. But eventually, in part due to government intervention, they had to put an end to that since most of their test subjects wouldn't see the light of day again. Instead, they shifted their attention to the more undesirable members of society, people which the government wouldn't really pay attention to. They introduced a program where the homeless and unfortunate could easily volunteer themselves for testing and in return would receive $60. And another $60 if they were allowed to install components into their bodies, while also removing any tumors, although the validity of that claim could be debated. At some point, however, even that scheme became unviable, as Aperture sunk deeper and deeper into bankruptcy. Eventually, they would manage to develop androids, which they used to replace part of the workforce, using it as a threat to employees in order to coerce them into volunteering for the tests. You can probably tell now that Aperture was never really the most humane company, although I guess at this point most of us have come to expect that from large corporations anyway. A bit further on, you get a pre-recorded announcement from who will soon be the second character you interact with throughout the game. For the time being, she welcomes you to Aperture Science, which we are told at that time had existed for 30 years, dating this recording somewhere between the late 70s to early 80s. This, again, coincides with the employee volunteering program and Cave Johnson's moonrock poisoning, something that will become a lot more relevant a bit later on. An exhibition hall you come across presents a brief history of Aperture and also confirms Cave Johnson's passing, therefore taking place sometime after 1982. However, it does also present you with a new portal gun as part of the showcase, and you can tell it's probably an earlier model because it's painted red, and also it dispenses blue and red portals. This is in fact not the first portal mod to play around with the portal colors. There is another which made use of a third, square portal and colored it green. But this variation was never referenced in the original game, so this is mostly just the community taking creative liberties, not something especially significant. After picking up the portal gun, you will actually have to traverse backwards through the level, back to the security checkpoint which you can now go through. I should also note at this point that staff doors will no longer open to you, and this is because during the calibration of the displacement device, Serling did have to remove your role as Aperture staff since, according to him, for the calibration to work he needed a registered test subject. You'll eventually end up on Test Track Lambda, and while still looking very modern for what would have been the 1980s, you can't tell that this was way before the Aperture Enrichment Center and the GLaDOS takeover. For one, the chambers are not fully closed in and you can clearly see the walls of the original salt mine. This is because Aperture did actually start construction at the bottom, and as time went on, the facility expanded upward towards the surface, hence why at the beginning of Portal 2 you can see sunlight, because you're actually at the highest, most recently constructed point of the facility. This would also mean that the test chambers you play through in Chapter 3 and 4 are relatively recent, once again speaking as to how much time must have passed since the events of Portal 1 if they were already in such a dilapidated state. These next test chambers introduce you to yet another new mechanic, the pneumatic diversity vent, a tube that can suck up any objects and transport them over to the other end. At this point, it won't also pick you up as it's only calibrated to support weights under 60 kilograms, so it's probably time you laid off the cookies. Down here, the facility is in complete ruin. There's numerous fires burning on top of mountains of debris, and the remains of random Aperture devices are scattered all over the environment. You can even see the exterior of various test tracks, and among them is yet another small office. This one strangely intact. There are a few unfunctional personality cores on the desks here, indicating this probably was some sort of workshop or programming office. And inserting yet another disk into a computer will dispense one of these cores, which once activated might sound pretty familiar. This is Emilia Conley, a former employee at Aperture Laboratories in the field of artificial intelligence, the team working on brain scanning technology to transfer Cave Johnson's conscience. As it turns out though, she herself ended up being uploaded into a personality core, seemingly accidentally and without her knowledge. That is, until you activated her. This is pretty significant, since until now there's only been one documented instance, well, two if you consider Aperture Desk Job, of the brain scanning technology being used, that being on Carolyn, or GLaDOS, which Conley will also say she had previously worked on. From Portal 1 we know that personality cores were specifically designed by Aperture to help GLaDOS maintain the facility, as well as mediate some of her impulses, such as flooding the enrichment center with deadly neurotoxin. However, Conley's existence raises the possibility that some of these cores weren't just programmed, but were instead Aperture employees, which, voluntarily or not, had their brains scanned into computers. Characters like Whitney, as well as morbidly the cores you incinerate at the end of Portal 1, could therefore have been actual people, meaning, theoretically, Aperture, at least according to Revolution, could have found the key to human immortality. Chapter 6, much like most of Portal 2, has you finding your way back to the surface through Aperture's various testing tracks. Throughout the chapter, which by the way is called The Climb for obvious reasons, Conley will provide some valuable exposition answering quite a few questions about herself and Aperture. One of the first things she reveals is that, having read through records, she found that she had indeed worked on GLaDOS at some point, but she has no recollection of it herself. This does coincide with what we're told in Aperture Desk Job, actually, with Cave Johnson telling us that the reason his head is so massive is that the scientists needed all that space to store as much of his memory as possible. This could once again mean that personality cores like Wheatley were at some point humans, but depending on how much of their mind was transferred, they might not be aware of that. Also, according to Conley, Carolyn never consented to have her brain scanned into GLaDOS, which might explain why when Aperture activated her, her first impulse was to kill everybody. On the one hand, it's possible she just didn't remember who she was before the transfer. After all, in Portal 2 it does take her some time to regain her memory of Carolyn, but it is also possible that she may have been so resentful about the fact that her brain had been scanned that she wanted revenge on the company that wronged her. That being said, I do admit that this theory is a bit far-fetched. We do know that what stopped GLaDOS killing absolutely everybody in the Enrichment Center was the installation of a morality core, which makes it more likely that she just didn't have a full conscience. Conley herself doesn't comment on that though, and as far as I can recall, nor does GLaDOS in Portal 2, so I can't say for sure. Anyway, I think we should take a break from the lore for a moment, before my head literally explodes. Let's just talk a bit about the puzzles in Chapter 6. A large majority of them take place along official test tracks, but there is also a decent amount of traversal outside of them as well. Most of them make use of pretty much every mechanic introduced so far, from the gels to the pneumatic diversity vents. The difficulty does vary pretty wildly though, but this does make sense in the context of jumping between different test tracks in a non-linear fashion. Probably the most unique puzzle in the entire game actually takes place towards the very end of this chapter, and the reason I'm so confident is because, well, there's no buttons, no boxes, there's not even a specific way you're supposed to solve it. There is an entrance and an exit, but the traversal itself, you create yourself. Basically, it makes use of just conversion gel, and you'll have to use portals to cover the walls in it, so you can place more portals and cover even more walls, until eventually you create a path that you can take to the exit. It probably took me more than half an hour to solve it, and believe me, it was a very frustrating half hour. I don't know if I'd say it's poorly designed necessarily, after all, the whole idea is that you design it yourself, but I will say it's a very ambitious attempt that borders on flying a bit too close to the sun, in my opinion at least. Aside from that, there are a few other pretty difficult chambers, but not anything as abstract, and the environments become more and more modern as you go, reflecting your climb towards the surface. Overall, I think this chapter might be the best in terms of puzzles and environments. It takes the most creative liberties, and the amount of mechanics being used is incredible. However, it is also very entertaining narratively. As you play through the chapter, you'll occasionally see some tremors, which Conley does comment on and eventually says might be tied to the displacement device you activated in Chapter 4, an event which she herself has no knowledge about. She does, however, seem to know a fair bit about the Spire, meaning it was probably being developed during the time she worked at Aperture, dating its constructions to the years following Cave Johnson's death. That being said, there's something else Conley brings up in relation to the Spire, something considerably more important. Much like any self-respecting mod in the Half-Life universe, Revolution makes reference to one specific thing, at the sound of which anyone remotely interested in the franchise will probably completely lose their mind. You might have guessed it, maybe not, but the thing Conley makes reference to is the Borealis. Ooh boy. Now, if you're not part of the 99% of people who just threw their headset across the room hearing me say that name, let me quickly give you some brief context as to what the Borealis is. It's a boat. That's as simple as it gets. The Borealis is a boat. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that it probably has more of a cult following than even the Titanic as far as boats go. Brought up for the first time in Half-Life 2 Episode 2, the Borealis was an Aperture invention which the Resistance speculated contained technology so far advanced it could completely shift the course of the war against the Combine. Now, I wish I could tell you more about what the Borealis actually contains and what makes it so important to the story, but the truth is, we really don't know. There's reference to it in Portal 2 and also the mod Entropy 02, which is almost entirely centered around the Borealis, but apart from that, we don't really have a lot to go off. Also, just to note, its depiction in Entropy 02, as far as I could tell, is just a Breadman's interpretation of what it may be. There's no way of confirming that's what Valve intended. I just wanted to bring that up in case people will jump at my throat for referencing it. The actual reason the Borealis is so important to the community, at least in my opinion, is because for decades it's been the key to the next Half-Life game, to potentially the first number 3 in the series. It's the last plot twist we ever got in the main franchise, and it probably makes up more than half of the Google searches for the Nordic Lights. It is, in every senses of the word, the cliffhanger of a generation. Sadly, Revolution doesn't give their own spin on the Borealis like Entropy did. It's simply brought up once and then not referenced again. However, it does go to show that Second Phase really want to tie their game into the universe, and I admire their ambition for it. However, I do have to add that the mod doesn't take itself too seriously either. It is a passion project after all. There's quite a few lighthearted Easter eggs and encounters, like this hidden room with a whiteboard, which literally has a to-do list for the development of the actual game. There's also a garage door and some Valve lighthouses on the walls, so this could very well be the office of one of the developers. You just don't really see fourth wall breaking inclusions like this in modern video games anymore. A bit later, while researching the Spire, Conley randomly makes a comment on the size of the data drives, which, to be honest, I wouldn't even bring up if it didn't sort of bother me. You see, presumably she worked at Aperture through the 1980s, up until her mind was transferred into the personality core she is now, which we do know must have been before the 2000s because she had no knowledge of the neurotoxin or Black Mesa incidents. But this would still put her alive during the time of the great advancements in computer data storage, a time when things like CD-ROMs could store up to 550 megabytes of memory, as early as 1984. I find it hard to believe that a company as advanced as Aperture wouldn't have this kind of technology at the time, so her comment on 20 megabytes doesn't really make sense. This could again be chalked up to a simple difference between real life and the Portal universe. Just because they're similar doesn't mean they're exactly the same. But again, we do have disks being used in the game, so the technology is definitely there. But I guess I'm just looking too far into it again. One thing that is relevant to the story though is what Conley found out about the Spire. She tells you that apparently Aperture had already discontinued the program, something that would rightfully concern anyone who worked for the company, considering how many dangerous and inhumane inventions they developed in the past. The displacement device must have therefore been so unstable that even they were forced to pull the plug on it. Cerning would have probably also known that, since he already knew quite a bit about the Spire, showing just how desperate he must have been to bring back GLaDOS, that he would risk destroying the whole facility on the off chance that he'd be able to restore her. I think if it wasn't already clear he's the bad guy, it should be now. Conley does bring up one other interesting point about the lore though, and that is that nobody's come to check on Aperture in the meantime. We know that that's because of the whole resonance cascade thing, and consequently the Combine invasion. But if Conley couldn't find anything about it, that means nobody from Aperture ever documented that. Which is probably because GLaDOS killed them all before the Black Mesa incident happened. However, it must go farther than this, because then again, the Combine never found Aperture either, or if they did, it must have been held back by something. There's not really any definitive answer to this, but GLaDOS probably had something to do with it, although we don't really know for sure. Actually, there is something that I just thought of while editing this. I didn't think of it when I was writing the script, but technically, according to Entropy Zero, the Combine did find Aperture, or at least they found a sort of sprout of Aperture. They found Arbite. So I guess you could say they did, but I'm not gonna say that's canonical because that is Entropy Zero, and this mod doesn't necessarily link to that. You know, there's a whole lot to it. I just thought, no, I'd bring it up since I thought about it while editing this. Anyway, back to my senseless rambling. It is pretty ominous, though, to think that all these incidents could happen and no one would know because, well, humanity is on the brink of extinction at this point. It makes your existence, both in Revolution and the Portal games, all the more melancholic. There's no one to help you, and even if you made it out of the enrichment center, there would be no one there, and you'd probably end up dying alone, in a world you don't even recognize, so completely desolate that it would probably drive you insane. On that note, you do eventually make it to an elevator that will bring you back to the surface once again, and also to the end of Chapter 6, which, like I said, is probably my favorite chapter in the whole game. I feel like it best shows how much work went into making Revolution, from the incredible level design to the quality of the story elements. It's just perfect, if you ask me. Chapter 7 and also Chapter 8 are the shortest chapters in Revolution, making up the climax of the story. Titled The Collision, Chapter 7 is the penultimate chapter and potentially the most dynamic. For one, it introduces an interesting conflict between Conley and Sterling, who from the very start don't seem to see eye to eye. After all, Conley was at some point a human, and after finding out about the neurotoxin incident, doesn't really agree with Sterling's idea of reassembling GLaDOS. At this point, the game introduces its last puzzle mechanic, which is once again unique to Revolution. It makes use of lasers and comprises two cubes, one receiver and the other transmitter, which remotely pass laser beams between them, making it possible to reroute them through walls without the need of portals. Some chambers also combine them with the pivot cube, which locally redirects the beam, making the simple concept of lasers a bit more complex. In this first chamber, I actually came across my first bug, a geometry glitch which allows the cube to partially phase through the floor in one specific spot. It doesn't impact gameplay in any way, it's just funny when it happens the first time. After a few test chambers, you and Conley go separate ways, and you're once again directed by Sterling, who is now a lot more aggressive in his determination to get the displacement device working. Much like Whitley, his character has gone through a complete transition, from the friendly companion he was before to an arrogant maniac hell-bent on bringing back GLaDOS at all costs. In between Sterling's rambles, however, Conley does let you know that there is a way the two of you can prevent the collapse of the reactor core without bringing back GLaDOS. I do have to note though that unless she can somehow speak to you telepathically, you'd expect Sterling to have something to say about this, but he doesn't. Earlier, however, he does let you know that the Spire operates on some sort of liquid gel, and assuming the game follows a narrative that Aperture only came up with 3, that most probably is conversion gel. But with that, you've actually come to the end of Chapter 7. I did tell you these chapters were short, I wasn't kidding. The 8th and final chapter of the game is forebodingly called The Remote Execution, and it starts off pretty strong. Entrapping you inside a hallway, Sterling tells you that he suspects you and Conley are plotting to betray him, and has decided the best course of action would be to kill you on the spot. This is a pretty weird decision to make. Up until this point, he's been insistent that the only way to restore GLaDOS is with the help of a human, so killing you instantly would ruin his plans. It could be that he heard what you and Conley were plotting, but he doesn't really put it that way. He wouldn't just be suspecting it if he would have picked up on that. If there was something I'd criticize about Portal Revolution's story, it would probably be this plot twist. It does make the rest of the story more engaging, since now the two of you are in direct conflict, but it does feel kind of forced. Yeah, Sterling has been quite unstable from the very moment you've made it back up to the surface, but this sudden twist kind of invalidates the whole narrative they've been building so far. Also, once again, this interaction feels very reminiscent of your dynamic with Whitley at the end of Portal 2, all the way to both of them wanting to kill you, feeling they no longer have any control over you, and threatened by what you might do. It doesn't mean it's bad, it's just that I would have liked the climax of the game to feel at least a bit more original. Coincidentally, much like GLaDOS in Portal 2, Conley is there to attract your attention to a means of escape from Sterling, who at this point is rambling about the different ways he could kill you, again showing just how psychotic he's become. If you don't follow Conley, and instead wait for Sterling's dialogue to run out, the floor under you will slowly start sliding away to open up a shredder as the actual means of killing you. However, even at this point, you can easily escape. The floor is moving so slow that you could probably watch the rest of this video before doing anything and you'd still be fine. Once you do decide to teleport out of the death chamber though, Conley will actually comment that Sterling was the name of a vacuum cleaner she made during her time at Aperture. To be honest, I don't know how I feel about this plot twist. Well, I guess it is a pretty Portal thing. Not much further on, you do make your way back into the Spire, and traversing through various maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts, you eventually reach the control room from Chapter 4. Also, just to note, the way you actually get into the control room is through the same chute you threw the companion cube into during the initial startup sequence. Quick disclaimer, the dialogue in this part coming up is pretty corny. It's not terrible by any means, it does present the tension between Connie and Sterling very well, but it is pretty childish. Someone on the Steam forums also brought up the fact that Connie somehow references Roombas even though earlier she didn't even know 20 megabyte drives existed. But I do think this is just a throwaway one-liner, it's not supposed to be read into that much. I would never do that. Anyway, this is in fact the boss fight at the end of every Portal game, the one where you finally take out the villain and save the day. In the other games, this was pretty much by shooting enough missiles into either GLaDOS or Whitley to finally destroy them, but in Revolution the encounter is a bit more complex. Your objective is to deactivate the core of the displacement device before the timer runs out, disconnecting the ducts leading into it, essentially cutting off its power source. To do this, you'll have to navigate some various fragments of test chambers, which appear to randomly materialize inside this level. Earlier in the game, in Chapter 6, Connie did actually bring up how, as part of its booting sequence, the Spire was teleporting away random parts of the facility, but wasn't sure where. This actually explains exactly how these fragments made their way into the Spire, since we already know its whole idea is the ability to displace matter from absolutely anywhere in space. Even the moon, which, keep in mind. As you detach each tube, time will be added to the counter very similarly to the previous games, except in this case, no neurotoxin is involved. From what I could tell, inside the tubes is some sort of orange substance, which could be propulsion gel, although it could also just be fire. I would have thought these would be the fuel lines containing the liquid Sterling previously mentioned, but that doesn't seem to be the case, although it would have been a nice detail. Fighting through the numerous turrets Sterling throws at you and traversing the ruins of random test chambers, you finally disconnect the last pipe, and the timer stops. The Spire is finally deactivated. Sterling can't use it to bring back GLaDOS anymore, and the reactor core is no longer at risk of collapse. It's a happy ending. Well, not quite. As it turns out, shutting off the fuel to the displacement device didn't have the desired effect, and instead has made the core even more unstable. Until...
Oh my... No!
And with that, the credits roll on Portal Revolution. A game made with passion by a relatively small but incredibly ambitious development team. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how Valve doesn't really make games anymore, but how the community have decided they don't need them to. They can make their own. And I think Revolution is a great example of that. Not only is it a great game in itself, it also easily stands alongside Valve's entries in the franchise, both in terms of gameplay, with its unique mechanics and masterful level design, as well as narratively, presenting a story solidly grounded within the Portal universe. Playing through Revolution, there wasn't a single point where I thought it couldn't possibly fit with the original games. In fact, if you didn't tell me beforehand, I could have genuinely believed that Revolution was a Valve game. Maybe except for a few voice lines here and there. And again, I think it's relevant to reference Entropy Zero. After all, it did raise the bar for good source mods. But even Breadman wasn't this confident with the original material at first. It took the team a sequel to take Entropy as far as they did, and to make a game as incredible as they have. But Second Phase has pretty much done it in one. Now, I don't know what development background the team already had. I'm sure this is not their first video game ever. It realistically couldn't be. But nevertheless, Revolution is still a very impressive game. And I urge you to play it yourself if you haven't already. It is, after all, completely free as long as you own Portal 2. That being said though, I am looking forward to the sequel. Because, as it turns out, I lied. That wasn't the end of the game. There is, in fact, a post-credits scene.
Hi. Hello.
Oh, I didn't think you ever told me your name, did you?
After the explosion of the displacement device, it seems you've somehow ended up on, well, the moon. A message left by Connie tells you that you're not in great condition, and the only thing she could do to save you was to put you in stasis, in hopes that your wounds would heal naturally as long as your brain was kept alive. The last thing you see before the transmission ends is a bunch of other people, all stuck in stasis chambers in what looks like another Aperture facility. And with that, the screen fades to black. And this time for real, Portal Revolution and this video finally come to an end. To wrap up, I want to first of all thank you for your patience. It's been quite some time since my last video, and I know you weren't waiting on a new one with bated breath. After all, it's not that serious. But I do want to provide you guys with some quality videos from time to time at least, and a few months is quite some time, you know. Other than that, I also want to thank you for watching this video. It's by far the longest one I've ever made. And, you know, writing it also did take quite some time, so I appreciate that you did watch it. But nevertheless, I enjoyed making it to the very end. I mean, I still have to edit it. It's not edited. I'll see how well that goes. Maybe I'll actually want to scrap the whole video when I get to that, but I don't know. I hope not. I hope not. Also, if you've been keeping up with the community posts, you'd know that initially I had a different video planned, but, you know, for specifically one reason that didn't really work out, I decided that maybe that wouldn't be worthwhile. And in the end, I'm glad I decided that, because otherwise I don't even know if I would have covered Revolution at all, let alone as soon as I did. It's pretty close to release. I mean, when I'm recording this, it's only a month. It's only been a month since Revolution came out, so it's not too long. It would have been a lot longer if I would have covered the other game first. But, you know, anyway, at this point I'm rambling. I really don't want to draw this outro out too long, as a lot of my live streams tend to go. If you haven't been watching those, by the way, I do live stream from time to time. Again, as inconsistent as these uploads, but I try. But yeah, at the end, again, I just want to thank you very much for watching the video. It means a lot. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And with that, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.